Cool. Hey everyone, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I really appreciate that you are here with us. My name is Barton Seaver. I'm a chef, author, seafood evangelist, cook, husband, father, and proud resident of the delicious, jagged coast of Maine, from where I am joining you today in my home kitchen. I know that we have a lot of new faces joining us today for this event on hearty winter soups, and we've got a lot to discuss here. So again, thanks for joining me. So for those of you who have joined me before, you know that I love to start off each of these events that we do every other Thursday or so with talking about something that I'm grateful for. The fact that we are here talking about food, feeding people is an act of love, it is an act of kindness. And so in the process of cooking, I like to make it a one where we are recognizing our gratitude for things. So things that I am happy and thankful for today is a really good friend and neighbor, Jen Fox. My wife went back to work last week working for someone else for the first time in an office for the first time in 13 years. She's been head of her own design studio for the last 13, but her return to office has made, daycare, a different circumstance than it was. And on a rainy day when I was hoping that the boys would just be outside, they're with a neighbor. So thank you to our wonderful friends and neighbors for that. That is what I'm grateful for, and I'm grateful for you. So our topic today, hearty winter soups. Now, I've got a couple of recipes that I've made up for today, and I'll put the recipes themselves into a Word doc and get the archive over to you. I wanted to do them up first before I wrote the recipe. So check back into the archive copy of this event and you'll find them there. But what I wanted to use them to do is to talk about some strategies, some tips, some ways to think about how to build hearty winter soups. So there's three different sort of styles here that through which I'm going to talk about sort of a decision tree of how to build them rather than necessarily a specific recipe. Now, I am not a vegan or vegetarian. I eat very small amounts of red meat. I eat huge amounts of seafood, but all of that and dairy is present in my kitchen. However, I know that we have a lot of friends joining us from the Ruby Forks Over Knives community as well. So all of the things that I have prepared today are vegan, vegetarian friendly, if not outright so, on the stove as they are now. But I'm happy to take commentary back and forth about what those changes are, what tips and techniques we can use to sort of float between those two styles of cooking. So with that, I've also invited a very dear friend of mine, Nadine Brown, who is a sommelier and a colleague of mine back from my DC days. She is enormously talented with an incredible bio. And as part of the series that we do, we thought, I'd like to introduce wine and beverage pairings to this. And because the events that we do tend to be thematic around something like this, next week is going to be Thanksgiving. So please join us this time next week for that episode. So I wanted to introduce wine pairings, and who better to do it than my dear friend and incredibly talented Nadine Brown. So I pre-recorded a conversation with her a little bit earlier this week, and we will swing into that a little bit later in this session, but I am so thrilled and thankful that she's joining us. So, okay, hearty winter soups, let's bring it in. First question that I'm going to ask you is, do you want it brothy or do you want it creamy? Now, brothy, think minestrone soup, think chicken noodle soup. A broth in which things are floating that are identifiable, pretty much. So that is the lighter style, not necessarily the less lighter in terms of calories necessarily, but a lighter style in terms of its presence on the palate. And then there's sort of a middle ground, which is a soup in which the ingredients have been cooked until they disintegrate. And I've got a Portuguese version of it, Caldo Verde, which is a potato and kale soup that is thickened with potatoes, so it's sort of a medium body. And then I've got a mushroom soup that's sort of a cream of mushroom, like a bisque type texture that has been pureed, mechanically pureed, or with a food mill, something like that. So that is obviously going to be the heaviest, the richest on the palate, the weightiest, and creamiest. So we're going to talk about sort of those three different styles, some of the things to consider when building those soups, as well as key points to the success of them, and as well finishing ideas. So the first thing to talk about is the base layer of your soup. What is your base layer? Is it stock? Is it water? Is it a meat stock, a veg stock, a tomato-y stock, etc.? There's all sorts of different avenues to go down, of course. So the key is to figure out, well, what do you need that base layer to do for you? Now, in a puree soup, like a cream of mushroom, a creamy mushroom, pureed mushroom, you don't need that base layer to be much. You don't need chicken stock or some roasted vegetable stock because, well, you're going to saute the mushrooms. You're going to add dry shiitakes or dried chanterelles or porcini mushrooms to the broth. I used a little bit of red wine, and on bottom of that, I've even got some smoked leeks. So I've got all these deep, rich flavors, the flavor development process that I went through. So there's no need to add further flavor into that. So I just use water in my mushroom soup, right? Now, in a broth soup, like a chicken noodle soup or what I've got here, which is a brothy butternut squash soup, you do need that broth to taste like something because it is such a huge component of the initial presence of it on the palate. So for that, you do need a stock. And there I would recommend either a light chicken stock, although I prefer and used a Hearty vegetable stock that was made with some of my late season tomatoes that didn't get quite ripe but weren't ready for the compost pile or for the chickens. And then in the middle, where you have soups that have the vegetables in them have sort of broken down to thicken it, you do want something with a little bit of flavor in there because it does play a huge role. But you also want that vegetable, in this case, just a russet potato. You want its presence to be full, to be known. You don't want to mask it with anything. And so for that, I used a very light, very clean vegetable stock, just a little bit of celery, a little bit of carrots, some onions, all went in raw, a little bit of fennel tops, etc., just kind of vegetable trim. So a stock that just has very light flavor to it. So that's how to kind of think about which style of base do you need. And then the other points of base layers are, what are your aromatics? So ways to add depth and richness of flavor to things. Smoke. That's me. I love me some smoke. In my cuisine, smoke takes the place normally of stock, of butter, of cream that you find so prevalent in sort of classic cuisine. And in that way, I used smoked paprika. Smoked olive oil is a great way to do it. Even smoked salt as a seasoning. But in my freezer, every year I grow a ton of leeks on my property here on our farm. And with several dozen of them, I'll just chop them up and I'll smoke them over the Weber grill. Not too much, just until they turn a slight pink color, just till they take on a heavy smoke flavor, but not an acidic one. And then I roast them in the oven, and then I just chop them up and freeze them in little snack bags. And I pull those out all winter, just as the basis of a saute, the basis of a sauce, the basis of a soup. They add incredible richness, nuance, and flavor. And that, well, it leaves you free to leave out a lot of other things that might be needed to fill out that soup or that stew, whatever it is. So smoke. The other thing is looking at deeply aromatic ingredients, spices, coriander, cinnamon, star anise, sort of the baking spices as we think of them, right? But those also offer such a depth and a richness of flavor, sort of a layering of flavor, that again, it adds a complexity that allows you to leave out other ingredients and keep your soups very simple, as well as not having to rely on butter or oil or any other fats or cream in order to add that je ne sais quoi thing that you want in your soup. Okay, so with that, I want to then talk about, I'll get into finishing ingredients, so how to garnish a soup. But let's dive into the soups. I'm going to talk you through a couple of these, and then I'll take some questions from you. And then we're going to roll into that session I had with Nadine. And then we'll finish out with a bunch of questions. And I've got sometimes these events go for a couple of hours, but today I've got some daycare daddy duties to get back to, my beloved boys. So I won't be here with you all afternoon, but if there are any questions we don't get to, we will get to them and respond back to you over the interwebs, over email. So I'm just going to grab, what is it, the first soup here. Now this is the Brothy style butternut squash soup. Now butternut squash, you know, everybody's familiar with it, especially those of us who are vegetable fluent. More often than not, a butternut squash soup is just that sort of ubiquitous puree, right? Yeah, but butternut has this beautiful texture to it, has this wonderful presence on the plate, on the palate that is really lovely. And so in this case, well, I made a brothy base to it. So what I did to start is I diced up some butternut squash and the butternut into about 3/4 inch pieces or so. And then, you know, just a scant bit of olive oil, I seared them very hard, very, very high heat in a thick bottom pan. Not to burn them, but to color and to really develop that flavor and sort of give some nuance to the sugariness, the sweetness of the butternut. You want to get a little bit of balance there. I then pulled those out of the pan, added some more olive oil, and into that I put diced onion and fennel. And the fennel I cut up into little strips. So I cut the bulb in half vertically and then put the half down, cut it along the equator, and then just into thin slices. Because you want to have some presence in the soup. You want to have some visual appeal so that you end up with different looking pieces so that there's something to look at in the soup, right? So you can see some of the pieces of butternut got a really deep, rich caramelization on them. That's perfect. That's great. You don't want them all to look like that, but some of them, it really diversifies that flavor. And then all I did was, once the onions and the fennel were slightly wilted, not colored, not sauteed hard, but just slightly wilted, I added veg stock back in, and this was that tomato-based veg stock. So it has an acidity to it that was really quite nice. Simmered the fennel and the onion. Oh, I forgot a major part of this. Jeez. Wow, there's like 5 ingredients in this, and I forgot one of them. Okay, the other one. So when I sauteed the fennel and the onion, I also added in slivered almonds. Okay, right? That might sound a little different to you. Not weird. Butternut, fennel, almonds, right? These are complementary flavors. But what they're going to do is, excuse me, not only bulk up the nutrition of this, the richness of it, but they're also going to add a wonderful textural component to it as well as visual. Now, as they simmer, they are going to soften. They are going to rehydrate. And so they won't be crunchy, but they will certainly have some palate presence on them. And it's a really nice contrast to the soft, sweet, custardy little pieces of the butternut, the soft, sweet pieces of fennel and the onion, and then that rich broth. Having that contrast is key to keeping your interest. Right? A puree soup, the same bite over and over and over again, it gets boring pretty quick, right, folks? So keeping that interest there. So then I added the broth. I added back the butternut squash, and then I put in a sachet of what is this? Coriander seeds. Now, coriander seeds are absolutely delicious, but they don't break down in cooking the way maybe a fennel seed does. So you want to put them in a sachet or just add the powder in. But I wanted to add the sachet, and the way that I use sachets. I go to an Asian market and they sell these tea bags, these wonderful packs of 100. And they're just these little bags that are meant to hold things in water without letting them get free, right? So this is a perfect thing to use. Makes it easy, sachets. And then the other thing that I added in, the other spice, as I was talking about, cinnamon. I put a cinnamon stick in there. Now, this is not like a mulled wine or a mulled cider flavor now. No, these are deeply savory flavors and ingredients that have been punctuated and augmented by these warm baking spices, the coriander, that cinnamon. And so you end up with this really lovely, really complex depth of flavor from the bitterness and the complexity of the burned butternut, the different caramelizations, the fennel, the almonds adding the aroma, the onions, that brothy, tomatoey. So this is a really great soup. Now, another thing that's key to soups, to me, is don't put too much liquid in at first. And the amount of liquid that you're going to need, even the most perfect recipe is not going to be able to nail what's in front of you. Because my butternut is maybe moister. Yours might be drier, depending on where it came from, what variety it is, etc. The fennel, the same. It's all going to be different in terms of exactly how much liquid you need. So my advice is to aim on the lower side of additions of liquid at first. It's very easy to thin out a soup. It's very hard to thicken a soup without changing the nature of what it's supposed to be. By boiling this down, I would disintegrate the squash, and it wouldn't be what I set out for it to be. Adding a little bit of water at the end, you saw how complicated that was. And that's all there is to it, folks. The same goes with salt. Don't season something at the beginning. Yes, all soups need a little bit of salt in the beginning because salt draws out flavors, it draws out moisture within ingredients, lets them marry together better. So a little bit of salt, yes, but season it at the end. Once you've gotten everything to where you want it to be, then bring it to full. So I'm going to get up again and get a ladle here if I'm lucky. My 4-year-old has a kitchen on the other side of our kitchen that he likes to take my tools over there. And oftentimes I'm cooking dinner and like wondering where my spatulas are. And of course, they're about 20 feet away. Oh, I love them. I wouldn't have it any other way, but that's what it is, right? So this soup is going to have that beautiful brothy, let's see, I can't really show soup very well. So it's going to have this beautiful brothiness to it. It's going to sort of sit up high. So those chunks of vegetables are going to be very visible. They're going to be appetizing and very visually appealing. And the garnish that I'm going to use for this is toasted bread. Now you can put 1 or 2 slices at the bottom of each bowl, deeply toasted, pour the soup over it, and that will bulk it up, add nutrition, but also add substance to it. But I also like to just put a couple of pieces toasted on top to finish it off. And then for this soup, I thought it actually needed a little bit of something finishing to it. And we'll get to finishers now. So acid in soups is very key because you're layering flavors together. You're marrying things together, complex ingredients and complex flavors. Acid is key to balance. Now, this soup, what do you think it tastes like? Well, it's sweet, right? It's butternut. That's what we love about butternut. However, because I used a tomato-rich stock, well, it's got some good acidity to it that cuts that down. But if you were using a chicken or just a blonde vegetable stock, it wouldn't have the acidity that would really be key to bringing it all together. So grab some lemon juice, grab some red wine vinegar, sherry vinegar, champagne vinegar, whatever it is. A few drops, taste it. A few more drops, taste it. And there will be a magical point at which it just goes, boom, it's perfect. But I've got one other secret tip technique for you from the chef's pantry here that you don't often see talked about. But when you're making cocktails, right, like mixing up your cocktail, what's the key to a cocktail? Balance, right? Along with acidity and richness. The other thing for balance is bitterness. What do bartenders use for bitterness? Bitters, right? So in a sweet butternut squash soup, you would be astounded at what that alone will do for it. Just 2 shakes, no more than you would put in a cocktail. I mean, you don't want it to taste bitter. You don't want to taste the bitters at all. They're just there to provide that last little sort of intangible rush, that balance to the whole dish. So there's some keys to Another garnish that I would use for this is some goat cheese, a nice bright acidic cheese just crumbled over top. Let it sort of melt in, but stay on top. It also offers this sort of textural contrast to it. I mean, hot damn, folks, that is a good soup. Okay, so that is soup number one. I'm going to return this to the stove, and then I'm going to talk about the other two kinds of soups here, and then get to some questions. So this one here is the Caldo Verde. Caldo Verde is green pot, basically. It is a potato soup, Portuguese in its origin. So the ingredients here are lots of olive oil. I'm going to start with a cup of olive oil here, which is, well, that's how the Portuguese do. However, they often start this dish with sausage. And for our audience, and also just for myself, the way I like to eat, I left the sausage out of the beginning part of the process. Typically, a rich, smoky chorizo sausage is used, seared in the pan, removed, and then the aromatics are added, onions, garlic, and the whole process begins. But for this, what I did is I started with a cup of olive oil, 1 onion, and then 12 big cloves of garlic. Now, I love me some garlic enough that, well, I live on an operated garlic farm. We eat a lot of garlic around here. And you know what? Hey, we're in quarantine. You know, you go ahead and eat your garlic because nobody's going to be around you, right? Or, on the opposite of that, don't eat your garlic because you can't get away from anybody, right? Those you're fortunate to be with. Anyway, I'll leave that to you, but so be it. Lots and lots of garlic, 1 onion, and I just rough chopped the garlic. I diced the onion, and then I added in about 2 pounds, 3 pounds of russet potatoes, peeled and just chunked up, and then added 2 quarts of liquid. Now again, I used that blonde vegetable stock, just raw vegetable trim, simmered down, bright light, and a quart of water, so a quart of the stock and a quart of water, and then I just let it simmer. And I let it simmer, and I let it simmer, and I let it simmer a little bit more. I'm lucky, my son left me another ladle. And then what you get to, after a while, is I used a potato masher, and you just get this wonderful, slightly thickened puree that's still runny, but it just has this wonderful texture. The potatoes and the garlic have both broken down to this silken texture. There's no granularity to this at all. And that's what you want. And then I just mashed them with a potato masher and then just let it simmer again until it reached the consistency that I was looking for, which is that of a kind of a puree soup. Now, the reason why I don't use a mechanical process for this, like an immersion blender, as I've got back here, or a high-speed blender like a VitaPrep or a Ninja, something like that, is that potatoes flavor is it's light, it's quite delicate. And when you whip something at such high speed with a mechanical process, you introduce air and you break down some of that flavor. And I find that flavor to end up being a little muted. And in this dish where your flavor is garlic, water, potato, you want your potatoes to taste like something. And so I just kind of let the simmering and a little bit of elbow grease to do the work. So the last and finishing step to this is some kale. And this is lacinato, dinosaur kale, black kale, that has been shredded very fine. Admittedly, this is some of the tougher stalks left on my farm here that Alden and I went out and harvested just a few minutes ago. But you want to cut them into small pieces because think about this. The soup is going to end up being this sort of tangle of kale in the potato broth. You don't want that kale to be so long that it ends up getting too tangled up and you're not able to get a good mixed bite to it, or that it's going to end up slapping you in the face as you try and get it into your mouth, and nice small pieces. So the last step of this soup is to add the kale in. Now I'm going to add a little bit more water to it, probably another cup. And I'm just going to put it back on the stove to boil for 5-10 minutes or so, just to finish that kale. Leave it with a fresh flavor, but all of that richness of flavor, that depth of flavor that we love about kale ends up right there in the broth. So I'll put that in the back there. And then I'm going to bring you the mushroom soup. So mushroom soup, cream of anything basically starts this way. And for this, I used butter to start off with because I like that richness of butter with mushrooms, but any form of oil would be fine for this, of course, or just dry searing them, roasting them to get a little bit of that development of flavor would totally work as well. But that's the key, is you want to develop that flavor. Roast those mushrooms, give them that darkness, that woodsiness, pull out that woodsiness of their flavor. The other thing that I added to this, excuse me, was one cup of brown rice. So rice is the classic thickening agent for bisques and other styles of soup. And so for this, instead of adding cream or sour cream or anything else at the end of this to thicken it, I wanted to add that rice because then it adds substance to it and certainly adds nutrition to it. And then I added, the water-based stock, but after I'd sauteed them down, I added some red wine. Getting back to that concept of acid in your soups, that red wine reduced down on those mushrooms while sauteing fills in that role perfectly. Now you want to cook off all of the alcohol smell from the wine before adding any other liquid. Otherwise, you're still going to have that lingering alcohol in your dish. But you get that richness, the headiness. This house smelled so good all morning, and of all of the delicious scents coming off of the stove, this was the most autumnal, the most wintry, so much so that my wife actually went upstairs and got our small Christmas tree that we keep on the table and brought it down and started playing Christmas carols. God, I love her. She's funny. But the smell of this will get you there. All right, this is a hearty winter soup. So then I just simmered it down for a long period of time. I added some dried shiitake mushrooms as well. Those add such a different depth of mushroom flavor to a soup than do fresh mushrooms or sauteed or roasted mushrooms. So the combination of those two. And then I did use an immersion blender. So I've just got this little stick blender or the wand blender. This is a Braun version. It doesn't get super fast. It won't obliterate things. If you can see, there's still a little bit of texture in the soup, the rice grains, and I'm okay with that in this case. That's quite a nice texture for this dish. And that's good. But if there's other ingredients, if you're making a beet soup, for example, puree it down, put it in a high-speed blender. When you add air in through high-speed blending, you change that flavor, as I was talking about, but you do achieve that utterly silken texture to it. So, again, I'm going to add maybe just a little bit of water to this. So I've got another cup of water just to get it to the right consistency that I'm looking for, and that consistency is up to you. And the garnish that I'm going to use for this is going to be like a chimichurri. So I've got some very fine diced Fresno pepper or red jalapeno pepper, green jalapeno, whatever you'd like for that. Mint and cilantro that are going to get chopped up. Now, mint and mushrooms. I hope you didn't hear it here first, folks, but if you are, get you some, because, yes, there's an herb in Italy that is given away whenever you buy mushrooms. It's given away with mushrooms called nepetella, and it is basically a wild cross between mint and oregano. And, yeah, you know how lemon and iced tea they're just kind of two different things, but then together they're just, how did I live without that, right? Once you have nepetella with mushrooms, you will just be like, how did I ever enjoy these before? So if you can't get nepetella, just a very small amount of dried oregano and fresh mint, or just fresh mint, chop them together, mix them, put them in there. Absolutely fabulous. So with this, I would put it on like a chimichurri. So I'm going to chop this, mix it with some olive oil, a little bit of red wine vinegar, and then use it as sort of a finishing oil garnish on top. All right, folks. So with that, I've now explained through the three styles I've got. We've still got the kale and potato cooking in the background, so I'll leave that to be for a few minutes. And so let's take a question. What do you say? All right. From Darlene. Hi, Darlene. Thanks for joining. I appreciate you being here with us. Where do I start to make good stocks? How long do they freeze for? Any specific containers to freeze them in? Thanks. Yeah, awesome. Well, as I've spoken about through this, there's kind of a number of different stocks that I have that I keep in my freezer. And to answer the storage question first, I use 1-quart plastic freezer bags. And I fill them up with about 3.5 cups. And then I lay them down flat on a sheet tray, a baking pan, and I freeze them flat. And that way, you're not trying to freeze cylinders. You're freezing something that stacks well then, and can be stored a lot easier. So that's how I store them. Yes, of course, there are Tupperwares and other things that can be used that are not single-use plastic, but I found that this is, for me, it's the best way to keep inventory straight in my freezer. So in terms of where do you start with stocks, start with what you've got in front of you. What I've got in front of me is some fennel tops that were left over from sauteing for the butternut squash soup. You don't have to have anything else. Just simmer these in some water. That's it. And you're going to have, after 20 minutes, half an hour, a light, bright, slightly infused flavor, right? And that's all you want in maybe the mushroom soup or in the Caldo Verde soup, as I had made. You don't need stocks to be an all-star on their own. Now, if you're making a broth soup where all you're serving is the broth, yeah, it's got to taste like something. But the questions to consider are, A, what's in front of you? What is easily used? And if you don't have enough of onion trim and fennel trim right now to make one, well, great. Just put it in a bag and freeze it. And then when you do have enough, take it all out of the freezer, throw it in frozen, and simmer it for 20 minutes. The other things to think about, do I want a really identifiable stock? Do I want a fennel stock? Do I want a roasted vegetable stock with deep, rich, developed flavors? Do I want a roasted chicken stock, etc.? And from that vantage point, then you go out and find the ingredients to make those stocks. So that's where I'd start from, is deciding what stock you want, what you want it for, what purpose do you want it to fulfill, before you start looking for recipes for it. So, hey, Darlene, thanks so much. I appreciate you. All right, from Susan B. I know homemade stock is the best, but would you share how to get great stock starting with purchased stock, either canned or from bouillon? Yeah, sure. I'm going to stir my soup here while we talk. And for this potato and kale soup, you do have to stir it because the potatoes, that starch will stick to the bottom. Wow, that's looking great. Cool. Just going to turn that down a little bit. So buying stock, buy the boxes more than the cans. I think they're just easier packaging, easier to deal with, easier to store. I found that the stocks that I am willing to buy in the packages, that I don't need to do a whole lot to them. There are stocks that you can buy a box of, a quart of for 99 cents. You're going to get not a lot of goodness in there. You can buy quarts of stock for $6. You can buy bone broth, etc., for even more than that. Stock is something that if you're going to spend money on it, spend money. Don't skimp on it. The cheaper the stock is, the more likely it's flavored with long polysyllabic ingredients that might not just read as simple as celery, right? But to fortify a stock, yeah, certainly, if you've got some fennel around, if you really like, as I do, the flavor of bay leaves and fennel seed, two spices that I buy in bulk, literally by the pound, Those of you who've joined me here before know that I like to wax poetic about this. Don't buy bay leaves an ounce at a time for $8. Buy them a pound at a time for $16. Okay? You're going to actually, I think, get better quality on the pound because, well, it's inventory that's being cycled through more often. Yes, you're going to have a pound of bay leaves, but yay, you'll give them away to your neighbors every time you see them. You'll, instead of throwing in a half piece of bay leaf into this, with trepidation, it's like, I'm just going to throw in 20. Why not? Because I've got them, right? So that's what I recommend. So a stock that you purchase at the store and then fortify with ingredients like bay leaves, fennel seeds, coriander seeds, etc., cinnamon, that would be the way to go. I don't think you need to necessarily fortify it or buy vegetables to fortify it. Just trim, butternut squash trim that hasn't been waxed, stuff like that. Unique flavors, I might add. But the only thing I might say that is go out and get it to fortify it would be an onion. Slice the onion in half, polar to top to bottom, and then sear it in a dry pan, dry cast iron pan with no oil in it, and let it burn. That richness, that darkness, that depth of flavor called onion brulee or onion brulee, that will radically alter the nature and depth of character of any stock you buy. In terms of bouillon cubes, yes, they have some advantage from a sustainability standpoint, meaning they're making a condensed stock and then turning it into powder rather than making and transporting water, flavored water, all the way to you. So there is that aspect of it, but I have not had enough experience with bouillon cubes to use that I would recommend any of them. It's not to say I don't recommend them, but none in my pantry currently. Hey, thank you so much. So I want to move now to this segment with Nadine. It's about 15 minutes long, but we took a little bit of time a little more time to introduce her, to talk about wines as we get into the season. So Patrick, my colleague at Ruby, who's the man behind the scenes at all of these events, if you would please roll us into that, and then I'll come back to you and we'll take some more comments and questions. So thanks so much.
Well, hi, Nadine. It's really nice to be with you. I will have given folks a little bit of an introduction to you in the live segment, but I'm coming to everyone here a couple days before our Thursday event, speaking with my great friend and colleague, Nadine Brown. So, Nadine, welcome to the Ruby family, and I'd love for you to tell us all a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into some wines.
Excellent. It's so great to see you. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Nadine. I am in Washington, D.C., Virginia area. I've been in the restaurant industry here for, 20 years
Wow.
now. Started as the host at the host stand, and I'm on the board member of the Restaurant Association. So I'm originally from Jamaica, so a lot of seafood. Lived in Jamaica and Puerto Rico, and I have 2 small children.
Awesome. Well, you're also one of the brightest stars in wine. You've won several awards from a bunch of folks, including StarChefs.com, the Restaurant Association of Metropolitan Washington, amongst others. But most importantly, I think you have earned the respect of everyone in your field. And thus, I am so pleased and proud to be bringing your talent and wisdom to the Ruby crowd. And it sounds like you've got family in the background, which is, hey, that's the reality of it now. And even more so, it's impressive that you're able to pull off life in general. But I also wanted to point out, just like you started off at the host stand, well, that's like everybody in the restaurant industry. You start off somewhere, and the best of us make it to the top, which you certainly have. So, all right. So, hey, let's dive into it. You'll see I'm wearing an I voted sticker. Congratulations to America, regardless of your political leanings. The bottom line is we now have a female of color as our vice president-elect, and that is a massive, massive victory. Nadine, what are you drinking these days to celebrate? How are you feeling?
Champagne. Any sparkling wine. DC just sold more champagne in the last 2 days than the last 2 New Year's combined.
Wow.
We drink a lot of wine here, a lot of reasons to enjoy. I've been drinking, I recently got a Coravin, which is a tool where you can get the wine out the bottle, without popping the cork. So you can go back again and again and enjoy the wine on the spectrum as it ages. And, my husband's a chef, so he works a lot. I don't always want to pop a really great bottle and have it by myself. So I've been Coravining. They're really
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, your Coravin, see, my technique for that is that my wife doesn't drink wine at all, really. Yeah. So 4 glasses is too much, 0 is too little. So I've got a vinegar barrel, which, at the end of 2 or 3 days, when the wine and myself are tired of each other, the last little bit goes into the vinegar barrel. So I envy your Coravin, and I'll put a link to that in the bottom of the frame here for people to check it out. It's a really cool tool. All right, so diving into the topic at hand, hearty soups. A couple of different styles that I'll be talking about. The first is a brothy style, which is chunks of something in a flavorful broth. And the one I'm doing is a butternut squash. It's been seared, little cubes of it. It'll have some nice sweetness to it, some almonds, as well as a little sachet of coriander and cinnamon. So with these brothy, light, bright, aromatic styles of soups, think like minestrone as well. What do you typically think to pair universal rules here?
My number one rule is to drink what you like, always, and
right
start in that that in mind. We were just talking about sparkling wine, so that's always always a great go-to. Something with just a little bit of residual sugar. I wouldn't do a vintage champagne, something with a lot of sherry, biscuity. So just something simpler. Gruet from New Mexico comes to mind. It's something that's fairly, fairly reasonable and approachable.
Yeah, I love that wine. That's a great one. And it's fun to see wines coming out of New Mexico, right? I mean, that's kind of come up in the years that you and I have been in this game.
Yeah.
So what about sort of matching lightness to lightness? Are you a fan of contrast or comparison?
A little bit of both, but sparkling wine, I keep coming back to sparkling wine. The Sauterne is a weight match, in terms of being both really rich, where something with more acidity helps to cut through that richness. So it's kind of I think that's one of the great things about pairings, right? It can also depend on your mood that day and how you want to enjoy your food.
Yeah. The Sauterne also, it does have a great seafood pairing, and that is with raw oysters on the half shell. If you think about, the salty sweet taste, mixing there. I mean, a salty, beautiful, salty, aromatic oyster with the sweetness of Sauterne is wildly good. And I recommend you try that if you never have.
Yes.
All right, so on to another question. So another soup that I'm talking about is a Caldo Verde, which has 2 ingredients in it, or sort of principles that I want to ask you about. The first is spiciness. So it's got a chorizo in there, red pepper, smoked paprika, big aromatic capsicum, poignant flavors. How do you pair with that?
Alsatian, the first thing, because of the spiciness and also the pork, drinking what people eat, whether you're in Italy and having an Italian dish and, pairing that with something. They have a lot of pork in that part of France. So an Alsatian Pinot Gris, again, with a little bit of RS, that RS really helps to coat, coat the palate, and doesn't conflict with the spice and the pepper.
What is RS? Your technical terms here.
Residual sugar. What you don't want to do is something with a lot of oak, because that will, accentuate the oak and also accentuate the spices.
Cool.
So not a big blousy California Chardonnay, a Barbera from Italy, something with a high acid and lower in alcohol.
Cool. So the other component of the soup is kale. I use a Tuscan Kale, lacinato, dinosaur kale, black kale, many different names. So thinly shaved and added in just at the very last minute or so, 5 minutes of simmering. So cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cabbage, kales can provide a bit of a challenge to wines.
Yeah.
How do you answer to that?
Kale, same principle of, wines that have a little bit of natural herbaceousness. Is that a word? Herbaceousness. Sauvignon Blanc, comes to mind. Another Austrian varietal, Austrian Germany, Gruner Veltliner, which sounds really fancy, but it's one of the indigenous wines from that region. And it has a grassy, goes well with asparagus, which is also, difficult to pair. Kale, artichokes. So those two, again, high acid wines.
Cool. All right, so we've touched on sort of the lighter, brighter styles, the aromatics in vegetables, some of the challenging things. So let's talk about creamy, rich, rib sticking, maybe not rib sticking, but full flavored soups. So I've got a cream of mushroom soup, or basically just a puree soup. And the basis of this is, well, the deep, woodsy, rich mushroom flavor. But I've got a roasted chicken stock in there. And I've also got smoke. So I use these smoked leeks to start off dishes. How do you pair with those big, cabin in the woods flavors?
Yeah. I'm going to go, Italy as well. Like a Nebbiolo, Sangiovese. You could do Chianti. You could do you could bring in some like that California, Chardonnay at that, at that point. Chardonnay actually does work well. If you could find something with a little bit of age on it, I think a lot of people think, Chardonnay has to be drunk really young, but the great ones hold up, over time and just get, a nutty character, that goes well with all those notes that you're talking about.
Cool. What about reds? I mean, you had mentioned the Nebbiolo, which is the grape behind Barbaresco, Barolo. Then you mentioned Sangiovese, which is the Chianti and super Tuscan wines as well. Right. One of the grapes in the blend there. What other things? Mention of California. What might we find on a domestic front?
We could do some Pinot Noir. I think there's a perception that all California Pinots are really big, and they're big, juicy Pinots out there. But especially towards Sonoma Coast, and people that are really pushing the envelope on less alcohol, more balance. With all of food and wine pairing. And cooking, right? Balance. It's about balance. I've had high alcohol wines that are out of balance and low alcohol wines that are out of balance. So it's kind of what you like, but definitely Pinot Noir.
Cool.
Always.
I'm going to add something to this and see if you'll agree with me on it. So with the big mushroom flavors, I like balanced Zinfandels. Like especially those coming from Ridge, producers who are not trying to make port wine out of Zinfandel.
Yeah.
Would you agree? Disagree?
Absolutely. I mean, Zinfandel, like Riesling, has a larger spectrum than a lot of people realize. Right? We think of Lodi and these really big, like you said, really big, rich Zins. They also there's a long history, especially in California, of blending Zinfandel with field blends. So there would be some Carignan, some Petit Verdot, other varietals blended in with the Zin, which is really common. Ridge does that for sure. It's cooking. It's blending to find just that sweet spot that they're looking for.
All right, one last question because we have a little bit more time here. So we've the Ruby family considered a lot of vegan, vegetarian, plant-forward, interested cooks. So one of the things that I'm talking about in the webinar is vegetable stocks, but one of the key components of that is kelp. So those incredibly umami-rich flavors, like a dashi broth minus the bonito flakes. How do you pair with that richness, that sort of potassium, salt, bromide-rich seashore flavor?
I've been also, with doing a lot of Coravin and really expanding my palate and getting into natural wines since this lockdown. Wines which, a lot of.
A dog too, huh?
Similar profiles. Greek wines, wines that have just natural solidity in them. Wines from the Ozark. There are wines being made in far away places that I think we often don't think of. Cider. It's not a cider, but not a wine, but really great. I'm sure there's great beers and ciders in Maine, correct?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, we're doing a really nice job with them. And they come in smaller bottles, so I'm more apt to open them for myself than a bottle of wine. All right, friend. Well, we're going to say goodbye to you. Thank you so very much for joining us. We're going to ask you to come back for Thanksgiving as well. Of course, a big wine pairing event. But hey, I really appreciate you. I appreciate you joining us, sharing some of your wisdom with us. You've given a lot of fun ideas, and I'm sure we'll get some questions for him and about your segment here with us, and anything that comes up that I can't answer, I'll certainly pass on to you. But we look forward to having you back. So thanks so much.
Hey, everyone. All right. Thank you, Nadine, for joining me on this. And hey, we'd love to hear back from all of you watching today. If you like that segment, and if you'd like, Nadine's going to be with us at least for a couple more. And, hey, I always learn something from my conversations with her. I hope you did too, and that you find that added information valuable. And, in the future, please send in some questions about wine. We'd love to get them answered. I, too, am a sommelier myself. Nowhere near the level of talent and skill and learning that Nadine is, but always happy to answer those questions as well. So while we were gone, I finished up the last soup, which was that potato and kale soup. Just simply put, it's just delicious, and you get those long, nice strands of kale to it, those little chunks of potato. I did finish it with a traditional chorizo sausage, just very thin slices of it. Very little sausage used at all, but obviously that can be left out. But if you want that smokiness, that slight piquancy, just a little sprinkling of smoked hot paprika over top, just to finish, would be perfect. Now I've got. I was trying to get some toast done so I could eat some of the soup before I came back, but I didn't get it done in time because my wonderful little boy came in and I spent some time with him. So let's dive back into the questions here. We've got 20 or so minutes left. I know that we're coming up on the 3 o'clock hour, so any of you who do have to leave, thank you so very much for joining, but I hope you all do stick around. So let's take a bunch of questions here. First, up at the top of the question queue, you'll see that Patrick has listed that Coravin wine system that Nadine was talking about. Great Christmas gift for anybody in your family who's a big wine lover. It's not a low ticket price, but hey, it's worth it, especially because it'll help you spend more money on the wine that you buy. So careful, but it is wonderful. Okay, From Jen, our evening schedule means meal prep and cooking can be pretty chaotic. Yes, hi, that's reality. Do you have any tips for making soups ahead of time or using a slow cooker for whole foods plant-based recipes? Thank you. Yeah. So all of the recipes that I've made today used about 10 cups of liquid, so 2.5 quarts. Each of them makes several meals worth of soup. So my freezer is my sanity. I'm with you in terms of just the chaos of the evenings. It can be a lot. But these hearty winter soups, they lend themselves to freezing very well. So go ahead and make the dish, freeze it ahead of time. The other thing is meal planning, obviously, is so fruitful in terms of helping guide your week. So for instance, at the beginning of the week, I do make big pots of quinoa. I will make a big pot of brown rice. And then I will use that for several meals. So the first night, we'll just eat it steamed out of the cooker. The next night, I will do a stir fry with the rice. The next night, or the next lunch, I will put it in as part of a salad with a can of chickpeas, shaved carrots, and a can of tuna fish, something like that. So that type of meal planning where you're doing the work once, but then it becomes basically a pantry ingredient, I can't recommend that enough. The other thing that I recommend that I got that really changed the way I approached meals was I got a rice cooker. I think it was $27 online. I got the Instapot brand rice cooker. It rated well. I didn't know anything about them. But I use that now 5-6 times a week if I'm not doing big batches. And just the notion that you can just put some brown rice on at 3 p.m. when you have 5 minutes and just let it sit there and set it to keep warm, and then it'll be ready for you. You don't have to go through that whole 45-minute process of actual cooking time, at the time of your meal. So the rice cooker really revolutionized the way I think about it, because if your starch is taken care of, all of a sudden, like, okay, great, yeah, I can manage a pot of broccoli, a pot of corn, and sautéing whatever it is I've got, sort of center of the plate. It's that one sort of base aspect to the meal, that starch or that grain. It makes everything easier. The other thing I found that makes everything easier is this toaster oven. Everybody knows who's been here with me before. I wax poetic about the toaster oven. I put off getting one. I fought it. I rejected it for a long time. But there's something so fundamentally easier psychologically about turning on your toaster oven than turning on your oven. Even though I have this beautiful, awesome, amazing, professional grade oven right over here that I love to use because it's a Ferrari. Yeah, it's Tuesday night or Thursday night, and that actually just works better for the way my life rolls. So it roasts, it steams, it broils, it does everything. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just a Breville model. It's just what it is. So, sorry, I got a cat who's very needful right now, so excuse me. So I hope that helps, Jen. So this is my cat, Minnie Biscuit, by the way. Minnie Biscuit is a good friend of ours. She's 14 years old. Yeah. She likes to eat butter off the counter. It's disgusting. All right, from Sarah. Hi again, Barton. Thanks for doing these events. Oh, you're so very welcome. Question is how to intensify the flavors of stock before I add ingredients so they don't break down completely. Would miso work? Certainly, miso would work. To the question earlier that I answered, I believe from Susan, about fortifying bought stocks at the store. Same thing. If you've got some veg trim sitting around, great, go ahead for it. But bay leaf, onion powder, cinnamon sticks, star anise, fennel seeds, those hard spices, they add depth and complexity very quickly. The other thing, and this was to another question that I saw about from Karina, what was the last ingredient used in the butternut squash soup, the red bottle? So cocktail bitters is a really interesting way to fortify stocks. Just as in a cocktail, again, you don't need more than a dash. I mean, 1 or 2 dashes is all you need to add just this kind of je ne sais quoi, just depth and weird balance to it that you'll never taste the bitter. That's not the point. but it just adds that balancing factor to it. So another good way to fortify it. But onion powder is a great way to do that. But look at those dark spices, those baking spices. Nothing more than 5-10 minutes simmering them in is more than enough to do justice to the use of the product. Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Where do you buy your bulk spices from, Lynn? Quite honestly, online. I just look for bulk bay leaf. I think oftentimes they come through Amazon small retail sellers. Kalustyan's is a great spice company out of New York. American Spice Company is another great one. If you just Google bulk spices, you'll come up with some pretty good ones right off the top there. And a lot of really great spice companies have, because restaurants are just not buying in the volume that they were due to the COVID pandemic, that switch to retail consumer focus, it has really brought a lot of really incredible quality products to be available. So the spices that I look for, whole, star anise, bay leaf, cinnamon sticks, fennel seeds, those are the things that I use in bulk quantity. Onion powder, garlic powder, no, you don't need to buy a gallon of that. You know why? Because you're just never going to use it. But bay leaves, yeah, I mean, use a handful because you've never had a handful accessible to you before. It's delicious. Star anise, fennel seeds, the same thing. You will have to train yourself to use more of them than you have when you buy the little 1 ounce containers. So just don't buy too much. Buy enough, but then just use more than you have in the past. So cheers to that. And I saw another question about what do I like better, fresh or dry bay leaves? I love them both. I don't have access to fresh bay leaves up here on the Zone 5 growing region of Maine. I do have some friends down in DC area in California that send me some from time to time. I get these little baggies in the mail of leaves. It feels rather illicit, but it's just delicious instead. Fresh bay leaves have a much more acute flavor to them. They have a much more sort of potent, angular, sort of high-level aromatic, almost spiciness to them. And I like to use those steamed with mussels, steamed with clams, with IPA beers, things that are bitter that really bring out that floralness to them. Dry bay leaves are a lot broader of a flavor, a lot more sort of foundational background flavor. But I wouldn't not use either fresh or dry in any application, but there are those subtle differences. So thanks for those questions. All right. Any tips for freezing soups from Marco? Yes, if you're going to freeze a soup, think about soups that will freeze well. So this butternut squash, the brothy soup that I've got here with those chunks of butternut in it, right now, this is incredibly textured and wonderful. It's got a diversity of textures to it. If I freeze it, yeah, by the time you thaw it out and reheat it, it's going to be basically a puree soup that didn't get pureed. It'll be a little bit awkward even. So think about what kind of soup is going to succeed being frozen. A soup like that, no. A puree soup like this mushroom I've got here, absolutely, that's going to be delicious. This potato and kale soup, absolutely, it's going to be fabulous. And just like I was saying in freezing the stocks, I use 1 quart plastic freezer bags, and I fill them 3.5 cups to the quart bag, so you have some room for expansion. But then also I freeze them flat on a sheet tray. And the reason for that is that then they stack up like books, and you get a lot more bang for your buck in freezer space and storage. It's just easier for me to inventory them. And in freezing them in basically 1.5 serving containers, I can pull out 1 for myself for lunch. I can pull out 2 for my family for dinner. So in that way, freeze them in fractions rather than freezing an entire gallon, because a gallon of soup isn't that useful because you're just going to have to kind of refreeze some of it. So think about the size and shape. So, all right, I hope that helps. From Carol, hello, Mr. Barton. What's your favorite plant recipe for any creamy-based soup. I'm especially interested in creamy tomato soup, and grateful to Ruby for such rock star chefs. Hey, well, thank you. That's a nice compliment, and we are very happy to be here. You are a wonderful part of our community. We wouldn't do any of this but for you. So thank you. My favorite plant-based soup recipes, the squash soups, I really, really love. Not necessarily butternut. Butternut to me has somewhat of a granularity, the texture when it's really ripe, when it's grown well. To me, it doesn't have the super silken creaminess that I'm looking for. But what I do like, kabocha, this is a koji nut squash. It's a new variety developed by Cornell University plant breeders along with Chef Dan Barber. Not genetically modified, just Gregor Mendel style field selection, growing to a chef's perspective rather than just growing to what farmers want to grow. Really delicious, super meaty, dense flesh that purees beautifully well. But in terms of flavor to volume ratio, few squash match this. And I really like that one. It breaks down also just in the cooking process, so you don't have to add cream or add any butter or oil to it necessarily to make it feel rich. As well, curry, squash, K-U-R-I, kabocha, things like that I really like. But a plant-based soup that I really like, and I mentioned it earlier, but you don't often see it, is beets. Beets make the most fantastic blended soup. Of course, they work well in a broth, like a borscht style, whether diced or shredded and then cooked in. But simply just roasted beets or boiled beets that are then simmered in liquid and then pureed mechanically with a high-speed blender. Talk about a silken texture. The amount of air that beets can hold to them just, I mean, it's has this sort of like light whipped cream texture on your palate that is impossibly light and beautiful. So my favorite, creamy tomato-based soups with tomatoes. Add a potato into it. Potatoes, when pureed, will hold a lot of air as well. So you're replacing air for cream or for fat or for those other ingredients that hold that air or give it that silkenness really that you're looking for. So potatoes are a good way to do that. Agua faba, so the liquid pour off from a can of beans. So, for the previous night's supper, maybe you're making a salad with some beans on top to save that liquid that comes in the can, and you use that to puree into your creamy tomato soup, and you will end up with a creamier tomato soup than you might have thought possible. Cool. All right, for Miguel. All right, I'll go to Miguel. I skipped Baby Ruth there. Some food has better taste a day after cooking. Is this the same with some types of soups, and which ones? Yes, absolutely, you're right. And the answer is all of them, pretty much. Everything tastes better when you layer multiple ingredients together. It always tastes better when it has a chance to just chill out and then kind of come back to life as its new incarnation as the whole, right? So you boil down the parts and you chill it out and it comes back the whole. Stews, chowders, everything is like this, with very few exceptions when you're dealing with very floral, very fragile ingredients. But I mean, you're talking like rose petals at this point, chervil, bright herbs like tarragon that don't necessarily age well or marry well. They get kind of lost. But basically everything else, yeah, if you've got the opportunity to chill it out and then bring it back up to temperature, all the better. But when you're bringing it back up to temperature, you don't need to kill it. It's soup. You don't need to, visit violence upon it with a high heat. Just let it simmer, man. Low, slow heat. Just, you don't want to mess up the textural, the structural components of it by applying too much heat. So hope that helps. All right, from Baby Ruth. I think we skipped a question there, Patch. Oh, it went down. I'm trying to lose my last 16 pounds and would drink a diet of soup that are sugar and carb starch free. Well, I wish you all the best with that. Now is the time. to be focused on those soups because you have all these wonderful, rich flavors that feel in keeping with the season. And hey, I always support anyone in pursuit of wonderful health goals, and I hope that you meet those. And we're here as part of your community to help you with that. So, hey, thanks for chiming in, baby Ruthie. From Joanna. I am a whole foods plant-based and would like help making tasty soups don't contain oil. How can you make satisfying filling soup without oil? Okay, so roasting vegetables first. You can saute them on dry heat. Mushrooms work well like that in a cast or in a non-stick pan, something like that. But say beets or potatoes, roasting them first with beets and potatoes in their jackets, in their skins, concentrates their flavors, changes their flavors, matures them in ways that oil would help to. Oil and fat broaden flavors. They help carry them through. So when you roast or saute or otherwise color caramelize a vegetable, what you're doing is you're broadening that flavor. You're taking away some of the acidity by sort of bringing the sugars to the fore. So that's one way that I would focus on that in terms of deepening the flavor and therefore the sort of the deep culinary enjoyment of it, the maturity of the flavor that we're looking for. And in terms of without fat, hey, look at ingredients like a beet, a golden beet pureed can help add that air and that texture to it, giving you that creaminess and that beautiful satiation feel about it. Potato can do the same thing. Agua faba, as I was just talking about, bean liquid, amongst others, pureeing and soft tofu is a good way to do that as well. So anything where the ingredient flavor that you're adding for the purpose of broadening and sort of deepening that flavor, where that ingredient's flavor itself is not going to compete with or counteract the flavors you're looking for. All of those strategies work. Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate you. All right, from Sandra P. Hello again, friend. When adding lentils to soup, they usually turn to mush. How can I avoid that? I haven't cooked so much with lentils as to have any tricks to that, other than to say the lentils that I use are the French depuis lentils, the green lentils that they retain their texture a lot better. Those are the lentils that I've always cooked as side dishes because of that very reason. Also, they have a real depth of flavor that I find not necessarily superior to, but certainly of sort of Grand Cru quality and status in terms of their plate presence. So I would look to those. And the other thing is to cook your lentils separately and then add them into the soup. So, excuse me, if you're doing like a minestrone style soup where lentils are but one ingredient, cook them separately. Same thing with rice. Add it in at the very last minute. You're not going to lose any flavor there. They're going to have time to marry and come together and all that. So that would be another strategy for that. All right, Sandra. Hey, thanks so much. All right, from Sheila, is the rice cooked or raw when I added it to the mushroom soup? So I added it raw. I like to get a little toasty flavor to it. So I sauteed it in the butter with the mushrooms. It got a little toast, a little brown. You can do it either way, though, but this way it skips a step. You are going to have to manage the amount of liquid in your pan a little bit more because that rice is obviously going to suck up that liquid rather than bringing liquid to the pan. So there you go. All right, thank you. From Trish, how many is too many ingredients in a hearty soup in general terms? Given texture, flavor, and variety, how to make a clear broth soup heartier, and what would you consider heartier clear broth soups? All right, so too many is when you don't enjoy it. Just like Nadine's, first rule of wine pairing is drink what you want to drink, right? It makes sense. I do think that when it comes to it, people tend to, and this is true of smoothies too. People are like, oh, I can put this and peanut butter and squash and where do you stop? The garlic? Like just kind of like, man, strawberry, banana, and peanut butter. It's good. You're good. Leave it there. That's a smoothie, not a hearty soup, by the way. Do not make a hearty strawberry, banana, peanut butter soup. No. So how many is too many? When it doesn't fit on the spoon. when you can't get one of everything in one bite, I think is probably a good physical measure of it. You can have a whole lot of things in there if you want to take the time and dice them all up fine and all that, so it really becomes this integrated sort of confetti-like soup. I mean, those are fun and beautiful and delicious, but how much do you want to taste the ingredient? Do you want to taste pasta if you put pasta in there? Do you want to taste the potato if you put it in there? Do you want to taste the lentil? Well, then great. Don't add so many competing ingredients that it ends up just being this melange. It should be a supporting cast of characters where each has a role to play. But if it just ends up being this chorus where none of the individual voices can be discerned, that's too many. How to make a soup heartier? Can of cannellini beans. Hey, it's really fun to say can of cannellini bean. There you go. I mean, hey, there you go. Get the low sodium ones so that you can manage, so you're not adding salt that you don't want in there or can't control. Give yourself that control factor over it. But hey, there you go. So, all right, I'm going to quick run through a couple more of these questions. I appreciate, wow, you have so many questions. This is awesome. But I do have to get back to daycare here in just a few minutes, so I'm just going to take a few more. But I will answer any that I can over email. But hey, I really appreciate you joining. And join us next week for our Thanksgiving special. So I'll be talking about turkey tips, of course, but mostly about what makes Thanksgiving good, which is the sides, the wine, the playlist, the company, just kind of what to think about and ideas about gratitude. And hey, just delicious vegetable side dishes. So we'll be sharing a lot of really cool things. And I'll put out a menu for you. And you'll all get an email about that soon. So, all right, a couple more questions here. Hey, chefs, excuse me, would you use epazote? I have to used it to make a mole, but could a soup benefit? Absolutely. So epazote, shiso, another name for it. So a very flavorful, very aromatic leaf used fresh, often in moles. If you eat sushi, sashimi in particular, you will see in the shiso leaf often comes served underneath the ginger and the wasabi, and it's delicious. It adds this incredible depth of flavor that is really completely unique in terms of it. But yes, one leaf thrown in, like I use shiso or epazote leaves the way that I use bay leaves. So throw it into a dish more towards the end of the cooking process. You don't want to boil it out. You want it to kind of leach its flavor in and let it exude into the whole dish. But it pairs perfectly well with sweet things. So if you're doing a sweet potato, a beet soup, if you're doing a butternut squash soup, right on. Just one leaf at the end there, or chiffonade very thin into like a chimichurri style thing. Great. It does go well with mushrooms as well. It helps to deepen richer bottom flavors. So cool. Good question. I like that. All right, from Sophia, when using coconut cream milk from a can, when do you use just the liquid and when do you use solids mixed in? So if you want the richness of the creamy, the fattiness of it, you add that in at the very end, because that can break. If you simmer that, it can sort of denature a little bit, curdle almost, and lose its sexy, silky richness. So I always stir that in at the very end. And I rarely use that, but you do use the liquid at the beginning because that will infuse all of its flavor into whatever is being cooked. And the way that I use that is, especially when making like East Indian curries, I will use the liquid, but then at the very end, once it's already kind of off the stove and rested for a few minutes, slowly, gently stir in the solids or the cream on top. So awesome. Okay, from Michael. Hey, Barton. Thanks for the love we have. First, what are your thoughts on using smoky spices for soups? Smoked paprika as an alternative to smoking ingredients. Hey, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of it. As I mentioned, I talked about that earlier. I've got smoked onions or smoked leeks that I make fresh and then freeze in baggies in the fall, and I use throughout the year as the basis of things. But as I said, smoke is an incredible foundational ingredient. Yes, it can sit on top of things and be sort of a garnish flavor, but when used in the bottom, it really adds a richness and depth that takes the place of stock, cream, butter, those other factors, those other ingredients that we use to add richness. Smoked paprika I use very often. However, I only use the smoked sweet paprika. The bitter and the hot tend to, even the mild, add too much of a kind of A1 sauce. It gets the aspect to it that I don't want necessarily and can't control. So I just use the sweet, unless for garnish, like a spicy on top of something, but that's it. So smoked salt, smoked oils, hey, great stuff. Okay, missed the webinar. Are the recipes listed somewhere? Yeah, Dina, you know what? We're going to be putting those recipes for these soups together, as well as a couple of other of my favorites, and check back to the archive, and we'll have that up for you within the day, okay? And I'm sorry we didn't get those to you already. Thanks for the wine pairings. Love it. All right, from Chris. Hey, nice to see you, friend. I'm glad. We'll bring Nadine back for sure. All right, from Sterling, I have a NutriBullet RX that blends and then heats veggies to make a soup. Ever used one? You know what? I have never even heard of that. I do not know. I'm going to look into that. Thank you for that, Sterling. How interesting. Sorry that I can't speak to it, but thanks for opening up my mind to something new. Cool. All right, from Alexander, hello from California, the great vegetable state. Do you have any secrets or tips for making tasty clam chowder, New England style? I do. Start with great clams is the first of it. Clam broth is also a wonderful addition, but making your own with really tasty fresh clams from whatever region you can get them from. But the key to it, aside from just the very classic formulation of fat, I like to use butter. I don't necessarily use bacon or salt pork or any of that. Butter is just fine for me. It carries the flavor of the clam beautifully, and I don't need a lot of bacon. Really good cream. Go spend your money on cream. I mean, it's going to be one of the most sort of clearly tasted ingredients in a clam chowder. So spend money on a good local dairy cream, non-pasteurized, whatever it is. The other thing is buy good potatoes, from a local farmer's market that have some flavor and character. Don't just buy potatoes because the recipe called for it at the store, where they just kind of taste like last year, right? That's kind of what most commodity potatoes taste like last year. Buy a potato that tastes like something. Again, you've got so few ingredients in a clam chowder. Buy good ones and layer them properly. One tip, though, aside from that, would be mace. Mace, the lacy outer hull of nutmeg, is an incredible ingredient to pair with seafood, and it goes beautifully in with cream-based things as well. Just a little bit will punctuate it in ways that you might be surprised with. Cool. Awesome. Okay, from Tom C. Hey, Barton, I grew up on Long Island, spent lots of time in Florida, Louisiana, so you love fresh seafood. Awesome. What's your favorite seafood dish to prepare and why? Any recommendations on how to prepare frozen seafood? So, frozen seafood, I cook it from frozen. I buy really good quality frozen seafood. We've got plenty of webinars on that. If you go back to our archive, you'll find lots and lots of information on that. I speak to it regularly. I cook it from frozen very often, right in the toaster oven. A piece of salmon frozen might take 30 minutes at 275 degrees, but okay, fine. Enjoy a glass of wine, twist my arm, or pay attention to the other things you're cooking. And you'd be amazed at what you end up with, starting with a great quality piece of frozen fish that was frozen well, cooked low and slow from frozen. It's incredible. My favorite seafood dish to cook is what's in season. I mean, the ocean is 50 feet that way, so I'm very lucky in that. I live on a saltwater farm where I have the best of both worlds. I love cooking mackerel right out of the water. It's my 4-year-old's favorite fish, that and bluefish, so there you go. All right, from Magdalena, how to add protein to a vegan soup. Great. So I added nuts into this butternut squash soup. Slivered almonds that simmered in. They lost some of their crunch and texture, but provide a nice textural contrast. That's a great way to do it. A soup like this, a butternut squash soup with a big spoonful of almond butter, cashew butter, anything like that, blended in at the very last minute. Delicious. Adds a wonderful counterpoint in terms of taste and texture, pureeing in tofu, pureeing in a can of beans. Great ways. I've got brown rice here that I started off in this mushroom soup, but you can easily do beans and rice in a soup that are then basically flavored with mushrooms and pureed all together. There's a lot of ways to do this. And I think one of the ways that makes it a little easier maybe to think about it would be to say, I'm going to make a big batch of soup, because it's hard to think, oh, I'm just going to add 25 beans to this small batch of soup or this much rice. You cook a gallon of it, make a gallon of it. Use a whole can of beans so that you're not saddling yourself with unused product here and there in small quantities that don't make sense. And you know what? Don't be afraid to get it wrong, too. I mean, pureeing tofu into something or a can of beans, like, you're not going to mess it up. I mean, if you're using ingredients that you like, cashew butter and butternut squash, I mean, those taste really good, right? You can imagine how those would taste together, right? Yeah, so if you just go with your palate, it's really hard to screw it up. Don't puree bananas into things other than smoothies. But, other than that, the rules are pretty creative. So I'll take one last question here, and then I've got to run. So thanks for the comment, Michelle. I appreciate you joining. From Brenda, can you share any tips on using nutritional yeast in soups, especially when doubling, tripling the recipe? You know what? I don't have much experience with that other than just using it as a seasoning and using it as you go. So small amounts. You don't want to, I've always found nutritional yeast is kind of like cayenne pepper. Whether you're making a quart or 2 gallons, the same pinch of cayenne pepper is enough for both. So I would suggest just using it in small, tasting it. Add a small bit in, taste it, small bit in, taste it until you get to the right place. All right, I'll take one more question because that wasn't a really great answer. Sorry for that. But is there an advantage from Jennifer W. to simmering veggies over using a pressure cooker to develop flavor? No, I don't think so. Pressure cookers cook more quickly. They break things down because they have that pressure that's pushing things through. Plus, they also have the captured environment, so you're not releasing any of that flavor through steam. So I would think that you might get a little bit more flavor and a little bit fresher flavor out of a pressure cooker than you would in terms of just simmering on a stovetop. But I think the nuance there is more what's most convenient to you. What works best for you, rather than necessarily making or breaking a recipe or providing one such a leg up on the other that it just outshines it. I think for lighter, brighter ingredients, fresher things, like if you're making a zucchini puree, something like that, where the flavor is a little fragile, it's delicate. If you're doing a lot of fresh herbs in there, yeah, use the pressure cooker, cook it high, intense, quick, keep all those flavors in there. But otherwise, I think you're good to go. Hey, but that's a great question. And so are all of these questions and that I've answered and the many that I haven't. Thank you so much. I do need to sign off now. I do hope you'll join me next week for our Thanksgiving special, and then therefore all the weeks after that. Please follow me on Instagram at Barton Seaver. Follow our good friend Nadine. Send in your questions early so that we can make sure to get to them. Check out my cookbooks. I've got 8 of them out in the world. National Geographic Kids Cookbook, a book on sea greens or seaweed, and lots of books on seafood that are really actually mostly about vegetables. But hey, we appreciate supporting by coming to join us today. Remember that feeding people is an act of love. It is an act of kindness. So bon appetit. I love you too. Take care.